Yes, Neil. Neil, are you there? Neil.
You'd have to press something.
I have pressing this. This is the caller thing. I pressed this. Neil.
Yes.
Here he is on the air. All right. David was getting nervous. He's looking around the studio. Who knows how to work this thing? It's my show, remember. If it falls flat on my watch. That was part of the plan. David, take over. Neil, welcome to the program. This is Narcissism 101. I'm the host, Jose. I'm happy to have you on. I have David here, whom you well know, and I'll hand it over to Dave now and take over and ask you questions and chat about your current projects. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jose.
Sure.
Well, welcome back to the station, Neil, for your third time around.
Yep.
And on your third show, actually. And I still don't have any official status at this station. Amazingly. Well, okay.
Just as well.
To start off with another stupid, meaningless question, who's your favorite Spice Girl?
Let's see, they don't have an Old Spice, do they? I think probably Ginger Spice.
Ginger.
Just because she seems to enjoy having less talent than... I mean, there was that wonderful line in The New Yorker where the guy was saying most people seem to grumble because the Spice Girls seem to have become immensely rich and immensely famous on the basis of absolutely no talent, whereas this guy's in awe of them because they become immensely rich and famous for the same reasons.
In a way, that might be the philosophical point of them, that anybody can do this.
Well, exactly. Girl power. I think they're great, and I love the fact that lots of my friends in England have their kids... friends who agreed to appear in their movie just so their kids could be photographed with the Spice Girls.
Really?
It's very much the sort of preteen phenomenon, which I think is very sweet.
I never thought of this before. They might be the music industry's answer to Image Comics.
Exactly.
Well, we are interviewing you to promote a reading that you are doing tomorrow.
On the Queen Mary.
On the Queen Mary itself.
Quiet.
This is a benefit for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and it will be introduced by Mr. Harlan Ellison, world-famous writer.
It will indeed. And then, which I have to say, is the person who will be carrying the body of this has a certain amount of terror involved in it. I mean, great, follow Harlan. The Stickmeister himself will come out and do stuff, and then I will come out and tell my little stories. It's sort of... Harlan is normally somebody one definitely doesn't try and compete with, but I'm really proud that he's introducing me.
Yeah, David, maybe you want to say a little bit to the audience about Harlan himself.
Harlan Ellison, yeah. He's a fiction writer. He's best, I guess, right at the moment he's on the Babylon 5 as creative consultant on a show called Babylon 5.
Yes, I've heard of it.
And he's also an amazing raconteur and kvetch.
To be expected.
He's just a great, one of the classic speakers. And so that's why Neil's a little trepidatious.
I hear
a little in awe. But it's fun now. I mean, I've been doing these what we call the Guardian Angel Tour readings for about 3 years now, and we raised over $40,000 for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which it's the organization that raises money and handles the legal things for comics creators, publishers, and retailers who come under First Amendment fire. Examples of things that they fought recently is they fought and won a case against the state of California tax authorities.
That Paul
Mavrides case, yeah. Where the state of California announced that comics were not literature and were not art, but were in fact sign painting and should be taxed as such.
Interesting.
And
and he won that one.
We won that one.
Yeah.
And one that we've sadly lost is the Mike Diana case, which
Incredible.
Is the first case in America of an artist being convicted of obscenity. A very nice young man named Mike Diana in Florida, who did his sort of little self-published magazine called Boiled Angel. And it was the kind of stuff that, frankly, if you saw it hanging in an art gallery in New York or San Francisco, would not raise an eyebrow. But this was Florida, and he was found guilty of obscenity. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He actually wound up serving, I think, about 5 days in jail. Then his sentence was suspended. The terms of his suspended sentence included the fact that he was not allowed to draw or write, even for his own amusement. And the local sheriff's office were empowered and charged to do spot checks on his house.
Astonishing.
To make sure he hadn't been committing art. And, it's scary. And you want to go there, excuse me, what about the First Amendment? So...
Precedent setting.
I wish we could, unfortunately the Supreme Court, the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund fought the case all the way to the Supreme Court, and they declined to hear it, which I think is very sad. What we did manage to do was allow Mike to leave Florida. He's now in New York, where, to be honest, I think the police probably had better things to do with their time than to check whether somebody's drawing or not. But it's really, and we actually allowed the community, we got the community service part of his sentence. He actually goes to schools and talks to kids about his legal case, so which is great.
Right. So the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is serving a important purpose for...
Sure, and there's lots of things that it does that are much less publicized. For example, recently one that I only know about because I was sort of involved. I have a book that I wrote some years ago called The High Cost of Living, which is a story about death, and death as a cute 16-year-old girl. And in the back of that, there's a 7-page supplement called Death Talks About Life, which is just a guide to safe sex and how not to get AIDS. And it's been used in schools, it's been reprinted, it's been handed out all over, and it's just printed in the back of this thing. There is nothing explicit or anything about it. And a cop, again in Florida, walked into a comic store some months ago, picked it up, flicked through it, and walked up to the guy and told him that he was not to sell it any longer. And that if he saw, if she found him selling this book with this stuff in the back, then she would come back and arrest him publicly and confiscate his stuff. And he called the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, their lawyer fired off a letter to the police station, and no more was ever heard of it. So a lot of what they do is actually preventive.
There's an old joke that maybe we should have let the South secede when we had the chance.
Well, definitely all Florida policemen who wanted to leave, they should have been allowed to go.
Yeah. So the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is definitely serving an important and vital function in our society, not just for comic books, but for anyone who cares about free speech. So if you ever have the chance to, you listeners out there, to in any way support the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund or anything that fights censorship or these heinous police state laws,
consider doing so.
Yes, exactly. Is it possible you could mention what exactly you might be reading tomorrow?
Well, I haven't yet decided. What I like doing on these tours is there's a total of about 15 different things that I might be reading, and I know that I've printed out 5 stories that have been written over the last few months that I've never read in public. So I have no idea whether people will like them, and I'm going to read one of those tomorrow. I don't know which one. I'll be probably reading my children's book, The Day I Swapped My Dad for 2 Goldfish. I will definitely tell a story about a little old lady and the Holy Grail called Chivalry. And I'll do some shorter pieces, one about Santa Claus, one about the effects of drinking. And it will be, it's funny, it's cool, it's fun. And I sometimes tend to think that nothing can replace actually hearing an author read their own work.
There's something to be said for that.
If there are any people out there, the other thing that I find fascinating is that, how do I put this? It's wonderful for me to look down at a room full of people, most of whom haven't been read to and enjoyed it since they were about 6.
Mm-hmm.
And watch them just sitting rapt, listening to stories. And it's great as a writer and as an author. You write in your room on your own, and you tap stuff away, and maybe you will smile at a joke you've just written. But it's different to hear a room full of people laughing at it.
Neil, if you had your druthers, it's a kind of an issue that I've thought about as a writer myself. Would you, if you knew you'd have an audience in any case, would you prefer to read aloud or just merely to speak instead of write? Do you have any qualms about writing? What's your relationship to your writing?
Well, I think writing...
And the solitude of it.
Well, I think you need the solitude sometimes for the magic to happen. There are the stories that you write where you know what you're doing from the word go, and you write it to the end, and it was done. And that you could have, I could have done to an audience or whatever.
Mm.
But the ones I love are the stories where I don't quite know what happens, and then somewhere in there I do, between one word and the next, between one line and the next, between one letter and the next. I know what it's about, how it ends, where it has to go. And it follows it straight as a die all the way.
So it has certain spontaneity that you couldn't reproduce necessarily in the context of a group.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's just that the magic is happening between you and the words, and it's as if the story takes over and runs itself. And that I love. There's no substitute for that. But it's also a lonely profession.
Of course.
Which is why, I love varying it. I think David mentioned Babylon 5 earlier on, and recently I wrote an episode of Babylon 5
right.
For the new 5th season on TNT, and it was wonderful, just partly playing with other people's characters, but also getting to come down to the set for a few days and watching enormous amounts of money being spent and all these actors and so forth just doing this stuff that I'd made up.
Yeah, that's got to be gratifying.
Enormously fun.
It's interesting that you're on this program because Jose, in fact, we were talking about this just before you got on. We were talking about how Jose has sort of developed an idea against the very concept of fiction. If you could maybe summarize it a little bit, Jose.
If I could, I would. But yeah. With 4 minutes left, I wouldn't dare to try. Maybe another program. Neil, where are you in any case, physically at this point?
Right now, I'm sitting in a hotel room in L.A.
Oh, so you're quite far off.
Well, it was just one time you asked me why I write fiction, and you said, why don't you just, if you have something to say to an audience, why not simply put it in an essay form and just simply say it? Why encode it?
Well, part of it, I think there are two answers to that from my perspective. One of which is just you sugarcoat the pill.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of saying something without saying it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way of...
But do you feel
fiction allows us to get into other people's heads.
But Neil, do you feel a certain, perhaps some conscience about the compromise that's entailed therein?
Well, only to some extent, because at the end of the day, fiction allows you to get into somebody else's head. That's the magic of it. And it's all very well in an essay to say, you should be nice to, do not persecute somebody of a different skin color.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. But it's another thing to read a book in which the protagonist is a character of a skin color other than your own that is persecuted for it, and all of a sudden, halfway through the book, you're going, how dare they do this? How dare they? And because it's you, and you're in there, and it's allowing you to actually take on somebody else's point of view.
It's a visceral, emotional connection rather than an intellectual one.
And I think, you need both in order for anything to work in this world.
I guess I advocate a kind of, part of what I do, I guess, I hate to say I advocate, but I suppose I explore the compromises involved, sort of between the visceral, as is being described, the visceral or emotional connection, and a live, if you will, immediate, which of course, presupposes the lack of a mediating form like writing to something live. But this is
I find myself reminded from that, though, of of Abraham Lincoln's words to Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Please.
When first he met her, she was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was during, and he said, "So you're the little lady that started this war?" And this was in the middle of the Civil War, and there was a very real level on which all of the tracts and statements that had been made had none of the effect of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly, there's the power of the word is legion, and I
think it's the power of fiction that must not be underestimated. Because the power of the word, we know about that, but the power of fiction to change things and to change people's attitudes is a remarkable one.
Neil, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
And we'll perhaps talk with you again sometime.
I'm sure we will. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And David, thank you for joining us here on Narcissism and bringing an interesting guest along with you. And a kind of a nice counterpoint to something I'm going to take up next week, I assure you, at greater length when we have a little more time. All righty?
All right.
All right, David. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. This has been and will continue to be the foreseeable future Narcissism. And my name is Jose. We'll look forward to talking with you next time, 6:30 Wednesdays here on KUCI 88.9 FM in Irvine. Coming up next, Christopher Robin, music, KUCI.